Alright, so in this last video on the blood vessels, we are looking at, again, I said this looks pretty busy, but it's helping to define what situations influence the blood flowing through the different blood vessels. So here, again, we talk about this idea of auto-regulation, which is going to be pretty much local, right? So if we're going to change that blood volume, like you saw on this slide, here would be ways that we would increase flow to one area preferentially or decrease it to another. So change of blood flow depicted by local receptors. All right, so it gives you example of vasodilators. If you decrease the oxygen in the area or increase the carbon dioxide or metabolic acids such as lactate, nitric oxide, potassium, hydrogen, inflammation, which we've learned about before, or body temperature, any of these things go up, and you're going to increase the diameter of the blood vessel and thereby have more flow. All right, and it just says you do this by relaxing precapillary sphincters, increase blood flow, all right, to meet your need, which your need has changed. Vasoconstriction, right, prostaglandins, activated platelets to, again, minimize blood loss, leukocytes, endothelians, this is a substance made by endothelial cells, constrict the precapillary sphincters, decrease blood flow, and again, so we get this ability to increase and decrease to meet your body's needs as needed. All right, neural and endocrine, right, which is a surprise. I said everything that we talk about is really has, on some level, the nervous system is going to have control, and then we're going to have some chemical control through some hormone that might be operating at a fairly long distance as opposed to the short distance local controls. All right, so here we go. This can, again, maybe long or short term. All right, a neural mechanism, blood pressure. We look at cardiac centers or vasomotor centers. So these are going to affect the smooth muscle in the blood vessels. With sympathetic stimulation, right, fight or flight, increased cardiac output, increased blood flow. Parasympathetic stimulation, decreased cardiac output, decreased blood flow. It's pretty straightforward. Blood chemistry, right, we have, again, the vasomotor centers. Vasoconstriction of most peripheral vessels through norepinephrine. Arteries decrease flow and veins increase flow, right? Vasodilation of the vessels. And this is done through nitric oxide or acetylcholine, which was one of our neurotransmitters. All right. Endocrine control, we have the renal tissues, adrenal glands, brain itself, and heart. So it walks you through some of the hormones we mentioned on the previous video. And say, again, these are all to regulate blood volume and pressure and or right, or through, I should say, vasoconstriction, vasodilation. So this is not, again, you are not going to study this and be tested on some figure like this. This just brings it all together if you, in a concise image of here's the influence and here are all the things that can influence. All right, so here the neural control, just remarking on that specifically, cardiovascular centers, right? So you have a cardioaccelerator, cardioinhibitor center, and a vasomotor center. So the cardioaccelerator and cardioinhibitor are really sensitive. So again, it's what are they controlling? They're sensitive to blood pressure changes, amounts of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and ions, right? So your sodiums, potassiums, hydrogens, calciums, okay? So these centers in the brain, right, neural centers found in the brain stem, affect heart rate and stroke volume through the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So it's neural, it's the autonomic division. Sympathetic, fight or flight, parasympathetic, rest and digest. So sympathetic accelerator, parasympathetic inhibitor. Vasomotor center is a separate group of neurons you'd find in the brainstem. And it's here we're mostly looking at the fight or flight, the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. And I say it here just to let you know that the sympathetic fibers are connected to most blood vessels except, of course, precapillary sphincters and capillaries, which really haven't any smooth muscle, but are controlled by these precapillary sphincters, and the precapillary sphincters have no nerves, and that's why we talk about them being controlled by local mechanisms. So, of course, this affects peripheral resistance, so again, throughout the body, which would affect pressure, right, flow, and cardiac output, because we said, you know, resistance is indirectly related to the flow, right? So goal here again is meet your specific needs and the needs of the tissue, right, and maintain adequate flow to the vital organs of the body. So we're still back to this idea of we got to meet our needs, right, and we have to keep blood flowing to the right places at the right times. All right, so this applies some of this neuroregulation in a specific series of events called the baroreceptor reflex. So baroreceptors are basically stretch receptors. They're also known as mechanoreceptors. So here's the situation. Increasing or decreasing blood pressure. All right? If you increase blood pressure, the blood leaving the heart, and these are found basically in the aorta and the carotid blood vessels, the baroreceptors start sending more action potentials. All right? And again, remember that you didn't need an increase in blood pressure, so this is trying to bring blood pressure back down, which you may see right here. So as we increase baroreceptor firing, we increase the cardiac inhibitor centers and decrease the accelerator. So this would cause you to have more pressure, and you do not want that. And you would also decrease the vasomotor center, which is applying resistance to the blood vessels, which would also increase blood pressure. Right? So as a result of this, right, the cardiac output decreases, heart rate and stroke volume decrease, right, vasodilation increases, and blood pressure drops. So the opposite would happen, of course, if you decreased, right, blood pressure inappropriately. So the baroreceptors would not send as many impulses. This would decrease the cardiac inhibitor center while increasing the cardiac accelerator and increasing vasomotor, which means more, right, smaller blood vessels, more resistance. So increased vasoconstriction, increased heart rate and stroke volume, blood pressure increases, and you restore the situation in the body. All right. The chemoreceptor reflex is not stretched. This is actually sensors that are going to be responsive to the level of oxygen in your blood gases, right? Level of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and the concentration or amount of hydrogen ions in the blood, and specifically the plasma here, right? Which is directly related to the pH, right? So as hydrogen ions increase, the pH decreases. And these are next door neighbors to the baroreceptors, and again, they're monitoring blood as it's leaving the heart, and that's a good place to be because the blood has just come back from the right side where we should have gotten a good exchange, and so the sensors are checking. So they send or influence the cardiovascular center and the respiratory center. So we have to add that, and the respiratory center is also found in the brainstem. So as your activity, right, your metabolic demand, right, your needs, right, you become more active, you have a greater need for oxygen, and you are producing more carbon dioxide. So as your metabolic demand increases, carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions rise. These are the strongest influence on the cardioaccelerator center and the vasomotor center. And again, we add the respiratory center here, which we'll talk about again when we get to the chapter on respiratory. So when you have more activity, you will automatically increase your cardiac output, right? And you'll increase your resistance along with your breathing rate and depth. All right? Endocrine regulation, so again, restoring balance to the system, the cardiovascular system. Here we have, one more time, epinephrine, and of course norepinephrine, which is closely related, antidiuretic hormone, the renin, angiotensin II, aldosterone, angiotensin I, angiotensin II, aldosterone, erythropoietin, and of course ADH could be included in here as well. So I just remark, and this is what I want you guys to know, is how do they influence? So epinephrine is going to extend the sympathetic and direct the blood to the active sites. Because remember, our whole point is making sure we meet the needs of the body. That's our balance. ADH, when blood concentration is too high, this is going to target the kidneys, right, and get them to hold on to water. In other words, don't release it in the urine. So this will help to prevent a continued increase in blood concentration. The RAA, which we'll talk about also again in the urinary chapter, this is when there's a decrease in blood flow, right, as sensed in the kidneys, right, the angiotensin is a powerful vasoconstrictor, right, and this is going to cause, right, an increase in blood pressure, because if you increase resistance, you increase blood pressure, and when blood pressure goes up, you should restore some of the flow. All right, aldosterone is basically sensitive to the amount of sodium and potassium levels, but what happens here is by releasing aldosterone when we activate the RAA, we get the kidneys to retain the sodium, and water tends to stay with the sodium. So while it's not as powerful as ADH at keeping, right, water in the body, it does have an influence on it. And then erythropoietin, again, this is because this allows us to, or causes the bone marrow to make more red blood cells. It's going to increase viscosity and therefore increase resistance. And as we increase resistance, we're going to increase pressure. All right? So here we look at, again, the short-term, long-term decrease in blood pressure or volume. So here's our problem. Here's what we're going to do immediately, right? Adrenal glands with epinephrine, norepinephrine, sympathetic, increase that cardiac output because we decreased pressure and we need to bring it back up, right? As you see here, increase vasoconstriction, so increase resistance, increase pressure. Long term, we have hormones to do that. Renin leads to angiotensin 2, which then leads to antidiuretic and aldosterone as well. And these basically help to retain water, and also ADH will stimulate thirst, and your blood volume goes up, and when blood volume goes up, right, your blood pressure will go back up, and your blood volume will certainly, be restored. And erythropoietin, increasing the blood cell formation, is going to increase your blood volume as well. All right, and then autoregulation, as I've mentioned in the table, and really in these slides, I'm just reinforcing all this, is this local regulation is due to metabolic demand. So you're suiting your needs on an individual basis throughout the body. Because again, you only have so much blood. Your vessels basically have to figure out where it goes. So when there's a decline in oxygen, we're going to see an increase in blood flow. When there's a presence of metabolites, we're going to see an increase in blood flow, right? If there's inflammation, we're going to see an increase in blood flow. If there's an increase in body temperature, we're going to see an increase in blood flow. I said all of these together stimulate nitric oxide formation from the endothelial cells, which leads to vasodilation. Again, increased blood flow. And we relax the precapillary sphincters in these capillary beds. So that pretty much concludes it. There's a lot of information here. And to avoid any confusion, again, hopefully I've been pretty specific about the things that you do need to know. You're not going to do any mathematical calculations for me on the test. This is just a good thing to be aware of because it allows us the ability to understand the heart better and to predict what it's going to do in different circumstances, which is important when you're trying to treat patients.